Hi, I'm Glenn Poole, CEO of the Australian Men's Health Forum. This is Men's Health Connected 2021. It's day 5, working with men and boys in all their diversity, and it's the 4th and final session of the day. Wow, what a day it's been. For those of you who've been with us all day, you'll know we started in the morning exploring older men, and particularly the risk of suicide amongst older men. We moved then before lunch to a fantastic session on working with culturally and linguistically diverse men. In the last session, we've been exploring the world of male carers from many different communities. And in this final session, we're going to have a go at exploring some of the intersections between different communities of men. Now, I'm going to acknowledge that we haven't managed to reach out to every single community of men out there. There's different ways of identifying communities of men. We've got a national male health strategy, which identifies 9 priority populations of men. I won't list them all, but it includes Indigenous men and men from low social economic background, males from LGBTQI plus communities, veterans, men with disabilities. There's a whole range, but it also excludes lots of people. We could look at men through different phases of life, as we have done today. We've looked at older men. We could look at men in different stages of life, like fathers and male carers, like we did today. And even within those specific communities, as we discussed this morning with the culturally and linguistically diverse community, did we touch upon every single culturally and linguistically diverse community? No. Did our speaker from Zimbabwe speak for the experience of every man from Zimbabwe? No. It's never possible for us to fully represent men and boys in all their diversity. And we acknowledge there are many gaps that we're aware of, and probably many more we're not aware of. But we're going to have a go at deepening our understanding of what the common themes are when it comes to trying to reach out and engage with men and boys in all their diversity. And to take on that challenge, we have 4 awesome men, each bringing a different perspective to the conversation. They are Greg Milan, president of the Australian Men's Health Forum, who on Wednesday shared over 50 years of experience of being in the men's sector and has a particular focus today on work with gay men. Fayel Saber, who's also been in men's health for 2 centuries, was around those first men's health gatherings we had in the 1990s, and shared some of his nursing experience with us on Thursday. And Fayel is of Lebanese ethnicity and an Arabic speaker. And a great advocate for culturally and linguistically diverse communities, full stop. We also have Michael Riley, who's an experienced counsellor who's worked with so many different men in so many different settings. First came to my attention hosting a webinar about the experiences of male carers. And so he has lots of different perspectives to bring to the table. And we also have Aiden Hemmerling, who we first met last year during Men's Health Connected. And Aiden works in the world of mental health with a particular focus on supporting those in LGBTIQ plus communities. So Aiden, Michael, Greg, and Fayel, you're all very, very welcome. I've introduced you a little bit, but I'm going to come to you now and ask you each to take a moment to introduce yourselves so that people get a sense of who you are and maybe give us a flavour of which sort of communities of men you'd like to talk about most today. And Aiden, would you mind going first? I know someone's got to do it, but they'll throw you straight in there.
Thank you, Glenn. Hi, everyone. My name's Aiden. I'm from Northeast Victoria, currently living in Wodonga, but have been away for a number of years down in Geelong and worked down in Geelong for around 8 years and recently come home. I work within the Head to Help program as a wellness coordinator. Predominantly at this point in time, I guess you would say my special interest is working with the LGBTI community, but I would say my main client base at this moment is the gender diverse community. I also have a background as a lived experience worker, and I do utilise that in the work that I do. And that's me from Wodonga in North East Vic.
Great. Thank you, Aiden. That's a good start. I'll come to Fayel next. Once we get you all introduced, we'll start to delve a bit deeper into your thoughts on the populations that you work with.
Hi, thank you all, and it's a pleasure meeting you, and it's an honor to be here, actually. My background is I'm a Lebanese migrant, migrated to Australia, so I call myself an Australian of Lebanese ethnicity rather than call myself a Lebanese individual. I have worked for the past 38 years in nursing, and since 1990 as a registered nurse working in emergencies, clinical nursing, and in diabetes, basically chronic diseases. My current position is that of a diabetes nurse consultant, and I work basically in the variety of diabetes. My interests basically are and I've worked as a multicultural officer, men's projects officer, health projects officer, worked a lot with migrants. My focus basically is in enabling, promoting better men's health outcomes for culturally and linguistically diverse groups. I focus a bit on the Lebanese community, mainly because I can speak the language. And there's so many anomalies within the Arabic culture, whether being a Muslim or being Arabic speaking, Egyptian, and so on. And, basically, as I said, my focus is men's health. I've worked a fair bit in Indigenous health, and this is something that I think perhaps Glenn down the track would be good to invite or have some Indigenous representations at the next group meeting, because it's an area, especially in terms of chronic diseases, so much in need of. So basically, this is who I am, and that's it in a nutshell.
Great, Fayel, and thanks for the thanks for your intro. Looking forward to what you have to share in terms of Indigenous men's health. Just to be clear, something we've always provided a platform for. Often we have an Aboriginal men's health conference. Last year we had 2 days with our Aboriginal men's health working colleagues, and we are planning a separate event specifically focused on Aboriginal men's health in the next couple of months. So yeah, very much aware of the work in that community, and thank you for raising it.
I'm very certain you are. I just thought I'd throw it in.
No, it's good to be really important to be acknowledged that it's a massive part of our conversation, just not present today. So Michael Riley, hello, welcome to Men's Health Connected for the first time, and would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Glenn. And like Fayel, it is a real privilege just to be able to speak to you today and be able to share a few thoughts. I love these sort of forums because I think I gain so much more myself personally, just from hearing from the expertise and experiences of others. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My background is, particularly in the last 20 years, been working in a range of services. I've worked with corrections and juvenile justice, working in drug treatment centres, doing a lot of group programs, which is probably like a deeper love that I have, working in a group work setting, although I do a fair bit of work on an individual basis. In the drug and alcohol, and particularly in the relationship counselling or relationship therapy side of things. So that's where my private work predominantly lies, with the counselling side of things, and particularly working with men. And when I say working with men, I specialise in men's behaviour change programs. So not only delivering and supervising facilitators of those programs, but or working individually with men who have used violence in various contexts and on various levels of the spectrum, but just really trying to support men in that space, as well as the families that are affected and impacted by that violence. So it's challenging work, but surprisingly, it's probably the most rewarding work out of all the different facets that I work in. And particularly when I'm doing dispute resolution. So when I'm doing mediation type work and working with couples that are separated or decided to separate, just still being able to give men that option of support and being able to provide them, whether it be counselling or other interventions that are just going to help them to be able to deal with some of the challenges that they're facing. And I do a bit of family group conferencing as well for the Department of Communities and Justice. So that's a quick snapshot. But thank you.
Beautiful. Great. Thanks for being here, Michael. Looking forward to hearing more about your experience working with men. And last but not least, our president of the Australian Men's Health Forum, Greg Milan.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. Yes, I have worked in the men's health field now for about 40 years, and I've worked with both gay and straight men, and I find that a really rewarding part of my work. Can I say that up front? That I've enjoyed so much all of my work with men, be they gay or straight. I've run a number of workshops. I also went through the HIV/AIDS period, which I talked about on Wednesday, setting up gay youth programs at ACON, Fun and Esteem, and then going to South Australia, Adelaide, to set up a program over there, which is called Inside Out. Both of those are still running as gay youth programs. So I was starting out, I used to be a youth worker and an adolescent health worker. And so that's where I thought I'd go with the HIV stuff, and then went into peer education work and a whole number of other areas, including setting up a project in central Sydney around the RPA hospital called Gay Men Fighting AIDS for many years. As that was a government program, not an NGO, but run by the area health service, that provided a whole lot of programs and support for both positive and negative men through what I call the bad years of HIV before the drugs arrived. And those terrible times when we were losing men and going to funerals nearly every week. And it was a terrible experience, but it was also very rewarding for a whole pile of people like myself who really, became involved with that. I'm a group worker, and I've run lots of programs for gay men. Partners is a weekend program for gay men on relationships. Changing Lives for Older Gay Men was another program I used to run. And with Blues Busters was a program for HIV positive men with depression and anxiety. That was a weekend workshop. It was funded by a drug company, and it ran for 8 years. And it was a real support for HIV positive men around mental health issues. So I started out with gay youth. I've moved now to where I live in Newcastle. I do a lot of stuff with older gay men. I've just finished running a program for gay bi men with prostate cancer and other cancers. And we set up groups for those men in most capital cities in Australia. That's still running. What I do locally now in Newcastle, though, I'm the coordinator of a program called COMAG, Community of Mature Age Gays, and we do lunch. In fact, I've just come from one today. We do lunch on a Friday every week at a different place, and then a Sunday lunch once a month. That program's been running for 22 years now. I took it over 2 years ago. It involves about 80 or 90 men, and I'll talk more about it later, but it's a great example of social support. I'll leave it at that at the moment. Yeah,
that's great. Thanks, Greg. Thanks for encapsulating decades of experience in 20 minutes. I really appreciate your doing that. So I'll go back in the same order now and just give you the opportunity to spend a bit more time focusing on the particular group you'd most like to talk about. So thinking of the group of men or males you'd most like to talk about, let us know a little bit, give us a bit of flavour of that population and what the common challenges that they face are in terms of your interaction with them. So Aiden, coming to you first, and I think, well, I'll let you define the group that you want to talk about.
It's hard to define a group, to tell you the truth. I think I'm very in line with Glenn in the way of, at the moment, I'm working with quite a diverse range of men in the program that we're running. And I guess I do focus on the LGBTIQ plus community, but even in saying that, I think my focus is men in rural Victoria above the age of sort of 18 and above. I guess for me, what we're seeing is a lot of men coming through or referrals being received that have never engaged with a service before. And I guess that is kind of my focus in the context of working with men that haven't engaged before, but also not necessarily, I guess, putting a stereotype or identity on a person. Does that make sense, Glenn?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I completely understand what you're wrestling with, but you're in a rural context, particularly though as well.
Absolutely. I think recently, from even moving, I've only just been back here for nearly 12 months, and the contrast to the accessibility to services, and I guess in the context of gender diverse people and the LGBTI community, that is something that really has been highlighted for me over the past 12 months.
Yes.
And I think also the gap in accessing services, they may exist, but actually the wait lists, etc., that can be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on the service that's needed for men and people.
Yeah. So in terms of, I mean, at the very beginning, I referenced the National Men's Health Strategy, which, to be really clear, along with the Women's Health Strategy, really struggles to actually make sense of where LGBTQI plus sits, right? It really doesn't actually lean into that at all properly beyond the bullet point. So there's an actual strategic level. There's a clear issue there, full stop. But just acknowledging that there are 9 priority populations is that you've already picked up 3 of them. So you've got rural and remote. You've got I think it's defined in the strategy as males who identify as being LGBTI plus, which, you know, I've never met a person who actually says I identify as LGBTI plus, so that in itself is complicated. Just like earlier we were saying, I've never met a man saying I'm a cold man. You know, no one ever says that. But also sometimes, depending on severity, people, men with disability also includes, you know, those with mental illness. So there's 3 sort of those priority populations all wrapped up into one. And the first word that comes to mind in all of those is stigma. But that's stigma upon stigma upon stigma by the sounds of it.
And I think that's exactly what it is. It is the stigma, and really working with men in particular to better understand what emotion means. You know, I think, you know, one of my first, you know, usually within the first session, I say to them, let's not focus on the word mental health. Let's focus on the word emotions, because I think as soon as we say mental health at certain times, not all the time, some people you know, feel comfortable with the word mental health, but some people, once you say emotions, then that's when the work sort of can begin for them. Yeah,
beautiful. Thanks, Aiden. That's given us a starting point for the conversation. That's really useful. So I'll move to Fayel now. So are you here talking about those mysterious cold men, or is it a particular group of
Well, the way I look at it is, as cold is just like a generalization for any individual from a different culture, or, I mean, it doesn't include Indigenous. Indigenous are within cross-cultural, but cold basically, you know, refer to culturally diverse, because we've got close to 300 languages in Australia, and nearly 100 different you know, population cohort groups. So basically my focus of what I've worked with, the clinical nursing settings, I've identified and nominated men who come from a different culture than Australia, and tried to promote, mainly because of language proficiency, mainly because of literacy, mainly because of inadequate information knowledge, and identified them as individuals in need or perhaps could be supported with health promotion, health enabling activities, knowledge and skills to make themselves better. But also as a diabetes nurse consultant, I've identified and also worked with men, whether non-CALD men or men from various cultures. And because there's a number of things that occurs with them, and mainly is because whether it's poor language proficiency, and especially with culturally linguistically diverse men, the health beliefs and practices impacts a lot on how they perceive their diabetes care management, for example, and they are, what you probably have to be aware of, they are at a higher risk for complications, comorbidities, because either they cannot identify, access, or understand the language that presented to them about diabetes, or because of the stigma associated with that, they fail to present until it's late. I've often seen individuals coming to me and they've had diabetes 15 years, just got identified and diagnosed, and they're already into renal failure, they're already into heart conditions, they're already into obesity. And this goes back to why I think it's important to identify and recognize these issues before they occur. And the one thing that I really am passionate about, we have to recognize Australia had been built on the back of migrants. We've got the World War II, post-World War II migration, the Polish, the Eastern European, everybody migrated here, and this is how it was built. And yet when you identify, as Dr. Hay was saying earlier, there's a lot of inadequacies and unrecognition of data collection. I know when I was working in 2005, 2006, I worked in Southern Area Health Services as the suicide prevention officer for CALD communities. And I was alarmed at the instances and the prevalence of suicide among young men. But because of the stigma, because of the shame, the family would say died in a car accident or died because of cancer. So it's like the hidden silent condition. So I think it's really important for us to, when we approach migrants, CALD communities, people with poor language proficiency, to really unpack those issues, bring them to the forward, engage with them, talk about it. And I think this is where cultural competency and cultural sensitivity and awareness are very important for all healthcare practitioners. So, and when you recognize that in the elderly, for example, sorry to take long, but in the elderly, there's, for example, 75% of men, we've got nearly 1.1 million men over 60 from CALD background living in Australia. A lot of them are missed or fall through the gaps in terms of health services. So there is a need for better awareness among government, among healthcare practitioners, in order to promote, identify, engage with these people. So that's my mission, I think, in life.
Fantastic. You've articulated that so well, and we're all of us here really talking from practitioner level about engaging on a one-to-one basis. But you raised some really important sort of strategic points, which is as you're quite right. You were referring to Dr. Michael Fay from FECA speaking this morning, highlighting the absence of data, and if you don't count it, it doesn't count. And that's exactly the same as we hear from our colleagues at the LGBTIQ plus Health Alliance. One of the big things they've been campaigning on is census data. And on one level you think, well, they're a health organization. Why are they concerning themselves with the census? But if you don't actually have information at that level about what's going on in communities, it makes it very difficult to make the case for policy and for funding and for services. And then practitioners are simply left to try and make sense of it and pick up the pieces at a grassroots level without any kind of significant structural systemic support. So it's great that you raised that. And I'm sure that's probably an issue that's replicated across multiple populations that are considered hard to reach. They haven't been counted in the first place for us to know anything about them or know enough about them in order to make decisions.
True, especially when you consider that nearly close to 21% of the Australian population, either from overseas born or of a parent of overseas born. And in some areas, for example, in Western Sydney, you've got the Celt population close to 53%, and yet there seems to be a big gap in service provision for that community.
Yeah, gotcha. Great. Look, great insights already, Faisal. And also, you mentioned cultural competency, and maybe that's something we'll come up to and tease out a little bit more as the conversation unfolds. But I'll come now to Michael. Michael, of the many populations of men that you've worked with, is there a particular one you'd really like to sort of lean into today?
No, I think for me personally, the diversity of men that I've worked with covers all of those, all of those cultures. It's probably more some of the marginalised socio-economic groups that have been difficult, particularly men who have been in prison or been involved with the justice system. They sort of face, unique challenges in regards to accessing networks of support, sometimes again due to that stigmatism behind their criminal background, and just building up their network of support, both in a practical way, but also, like Aiden was saying earlier, from an emotional level, getting them to understand how to support themselves as an individual in developing their emotional vocabulary and being able to understand what's happening for them, rather than maintaining that persona of strength, which is about being on your own and doing it on your own. So that sort of inbuilt mechanism of support that doesn't allow them to reach out and accept and ask for help. And that's probably the biggest sort of challenge that I find with all men, but particularly with that sector, because particularly when you're working with men in the justice system, reaching out and asking for support can be seen as a weakness. And depending on, particularly if they're still involved with the criminal justice system, again, they have to put on that persona. I remember working with particularly young offenders. We were doing some work for 18 to 24-year-olds, and it was amazing the transition behind their attitude when you would work with them individually or even in small groups, when you had them away from their culture, so away from their wing, and how receptive and open they could be. But as soon as they go back to their culture and into their environment, you could sometimes barely get a hello or some sort of recognition that they even knew you, because it was seen as a weakness. So it's just overcoming some of those barriers.
That's great insight, Michael. I've just instantly been reminded of a podcast I was listening to just a couple of weeks ago from an ex-convict in the UK who's now one of the world's leading Ironmen, right? And he broke world records on rowing machines in prison without even realizing he was so good. But the transformation point that he talked about was his survival initially was to not become institutionalized, so to put himself as one of the prisoners against the system. And so he was very much, he played the game and he looked like he was ticking all the right boxes, but he was very much against the system. And it became a point where he heard on the TV that a friend of his had died shoplifting in the Netherlands. And at that point, he just looked around at the rest of the prison community and thought, I don't want to be one of you. But so he was released from that, having to be sort of identify with the prison population, but then had no one. But at the same time, he couldn't suddenly become one of the warders. He was completely at sea, and it was only that point of like turning to his solitary sort of rowing and breaking records that kept him going and got him out there. That ability to break out of an unhealthy culture, whatever that culture is, in order to enable transformation is a really powerful point. Also,
and actually,
go.
Oh no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Carry on.
Just your point about the institutional. I've come across some men that I've been working with on an individual basis that are actually custodial guards.
Right.
It's really fascinating because that was one of the challenges that I personally found quite difficult working in some of those environments, was that the institutionalized attitude of particularly men as well, because I work with the women as well, but particularly with the men, also translated through to the guards, both men and women guards, like custodial officers. And even just with these individual men at the moment who are struggling with, their emotional regulation, they've also realized that working in that environment institutionalizes them to adopt and cultivate some of the attitudes that they're seeing in the prison population. Right. And it's really fascinating challenge to help these men to, again, break out of that institutionalized mindset. And I always found working in those environments, the issue of emotional contagion was really predominant, because typically you would, turn up every day at work, and the helping professions were typically regarded as the Care Bears. And so you were straight away categorized in that fashion. And so you often wouldn't get the support necessarily from the custodial population, which you needed to get to be able to access our clients, which were the prisoners. So, but that emotional contagion of working in that environment where people were often negative and critical and complaining, rubs off even on staff, even colleagues that I still catch up with now. I sort of work with them a little bit to try to help them to be able to manage some of that emotional contagion that they're picking up, and that then translates into other areas of their life. Many who have said that, prior to working in that environment, they didn't swear. And within 6 months of working in that environment, they would come home and they were just swearing like a trooper. Yeah. So just little behaviours like that that translate into other aspects of our relationships are really important.
Yeah,
just really to monitor.
Yeah, really interesting, Michael. Thank you. And you've also sort of ticked two more. I guess we're playing priority population bingo a little bit here. And you've ticked two more of the boxes in the National Men's Health Strategy, which is men in the justice system and men from low socioeconomic backgrounds as well, which kind of starts to lean into the next part of the conversation. And we've already begun to touch upon it. I mean, Aiden sort of ticked three boxes in one quick sentence with rural and LGBTI and mental illness. So moving to you, Greg, what I want to think about now is how do those what happens when you start to pile on the different layers? So you're talking about gay men, but how much more challenging and difficult does it become when it becomes a gay older man or a gay man with a disease like prostate cancer? What are the extra layers of challenge that you've seen gay men facing when they've got those? I mean, I've used the story a couple of times this week of the gay man who's a veteran, who, because he was a veteran in the 1960s when he was conscripted to fight in. So I met an old gay veteran this week, and his story was so rich. and it had the trauma of being a veteran, but not just the trauma of being a veteran who chose to go in the army, a trauma of a gay man who was conscripted into an army that wasn't welcoming of gay men, and then has now become an older man. So yeah, that example really sticks in my mind. His story was so rich. But what about you? What challenges are you seeing as those different kind of populations and different kind of characteristics are layered upon being gay?
Well, I'd like to focus for a bit just on my experience in working with Prostrate Cancer Foundation in Australia with PCFA for the last 8 years in setting up those groups for gay and bisexual men. And I went to a lot of their conferences, and I remember after we'd done our research in Sydney and Melbourne, I presented at one of their conferences in Tamworth, and I was pointing out the differences for gay men, and that to an audience who went, oh, well, you know, why are gay men different with prostate cancer? Well, if they're a couple, they could both get it, and they could move from being partner to carer. And a lot of gay and bisexual men from the research, and we know, are single. There's a high proportion of gay men single than if we looked at straight men. So they're going through this cancer ordeal on their own or with their gay friends. Huge amount of discrimination and not understanding by healthcare workers. A whole range of things. And people afterwards, that the people who work as PCFA support group people across Australia are some of the most amazing people I've ever met. They came up and thought, I've never thought of that if two gay men were, you know, and they were in a relationship, they could both get prostate cancer. I'm thinking, oh, really? You haven't thought of that? Okay, that's fine. So I think what we were doing was you know, informing them more about how difficult it is and to deal with this disease. And it is hard. The men's centre that's being set up at St Vincent's that Michael Whitehouse talked about yesterday is a great step in the right direction. I'm actually very honoured to be on the advisory committee of that, and he's going to set that up in the future as a place where we can start educating our healthcare workers and doctors and urologists and all of them about how to deal with gay, bi, and if we go into intersex and other sexualities of men, how to do that properly, because they don't have a very good idea, and there is a lot of discrimination out there. And as I was saying, I work with older men now, and Cancer Mate is for men with all cancers, not just prostate cancer. And it's a huge health issue. 1 in 2 men in this country are going to be affected by cancer in a lifetime, half of the population. But we've got to have in place mechanisms in the healthcare system that don't discriminate and don't stigmatise against someone, you know, who isn't a straight male with a cancer, because we do have different needs and different issues for gay and bi men. And so it's getting better, but it's an ongoing process that we have to keep at all the time.
Great, thanks, Greg. So I want to move the conversation on a little bit as we start to look at those sort of overlapping intersections, and ask. I'm just going to give rather than ask a question, I'm going to give a couple of examples, because I'm not quite sure how to frame this question, but just see what my sharing sparks in you from your experience. So the kind of question I wanted to ask is, you know, to what extent do those multiple intersections increase exclusion, but also to what extent can they potentially provide opportunities for inclusion? Now, that's quite a conceptual idea, but let me give you a couple of examples. So, you know, if we just take men as a group, we constantly bemoan the fact that men don't engage with services, right? So there aren't many opportunities to engage with men because men don't engage with services. But I often talk about how fatherhood, becoming a father for the first time, is a massive opportunity to engage with men, and there's a lot of great work being done in that area, not just to engage them in information about how to be a supportive you know, partner to the birthing mother, or to be a good carer to the kids, but to look at their own health and well-being, to look at whether they're smoking or taking good care of their own health or their diet or whatever. And men are often really up for that conversation at that point in time, because they're actually beginning to think about their responsibility for another person, not just for themselves. So I often say that men suddenly becoming a father, for example, is a massive opportunity to engage. I used to do lots of work with charities working with male victims of sexual abuse in the UK. And one of the differences between male victims and female victims is the number of years it takes to disclose. It's often 10, 20, 30, 40 years longer for men on average. And what would often happen, it would be them falling into another area of service. So, for example, acting out, taking risks, going off the rails, ending up in prison. It wasn't until that point where they actually got picked up by a counsellor. They weren't sort of addressed as a male victim or male survivor. They were addressed as an alcoholic or someone with a mental illness or someone who was now an offender. And at that point, it got picked up that they had this past trauma. And even just today, talking with male carers. And the stresses that male carers can experience, and the heartache that often goes with becoming a carer for a family member who's struggling or even dying. Also, we heard prevents many rewards and opportunities to deepen relationships, to explore our emotional side. So if that sparks anything in you, are the ways in which diversity actually creates opportunities for inclusion rather than being a driver of exclusion. Aiden, if you could bounce off that. Just see what comes out and share your experience, my friend. And you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, no, that's all right. It's a tricky one, I think. Well, when I'm talking in relation to emotional well-being or mental health, I think it's a very individualized experience for people. So that can be a barrier, I guess, sometimes in working with men in general and around different groups of people. I guess one of the examples I can use most recently was I could see that there was a real gap in the context of LGBTIQ support, in mental health support, in relation to sort of gathering or a mental health kind of support group in this area. And then after working in the program for a while, I was actually, you know what, there's generally a gap in relation to mental health support and space. So I sort of did go back to my manager and said, you know what, we could just do this group as a mental health support group for men. And I think even with the barriers in the context of heterosexual men that may not have really had conversed with same-sex attracted men, I personally don't think that would be an issue. I think that's something where people can actually learn through their emotional experience that, you know what, we all have feelings, we all have emotions, and that's the purpose of why we're here. So I think it's something that definitely needs to be worked on, I think, well, I know within this area, I think there needs to be more done in the context of the them and us. I think there's still this very strong them and us, that separation in regards to sexuality yeah, I don't know, it's something that's hard to explain. I can't get it out.
All this time on Zoom, and I've still got to remember to unmute myself. But you're, I think, you're a peer worker, right? And so there's something in, so as a peer worker, you're a peer worker. Are you a peer worker first and foremost in terms of, I've had mental health issues, so if you've got mental health issues, you can connect with me, or are you, or is it that I've got mental health issues and experience of being gay, so it's only if you're a gay person with mental health issues, where does the peer create an intersection? Because from my experience,
okay,
go.
So in my current role, I'm not a peer worker.
Okay.
But in the context of my experience as a survivor of childhood institutional abuse, is that I think in my perspective of mental health in general and emotional well-being is it's not about identity. It's about someone coming and seeking support, and no matter who they are. And I think this is the key for me, is that not necessarily the people that are coming to us, it's the people that are actually providing the support that need to work on stepping into their discomfort when working with people and taking away someone's label or stereotype. Because once we can converse in a real conversation and actually share our own personal experiences, no matter your role, I don't care about whether you're a clinical worker or you're a doctor or whoever you are, is if you can converse with someone and show just a little bit of authenticity and say, you know what, I can actually relate to that. You know, I've had experience with that. You don't necessarily have to share your story. It's just about saying to someone, I understand you. Let's explore that further. What are the factors that are impacting on you now? And how can we look at this and coordinate this to ensure that you're in charge? But if you need me, I will stand beside you and guide you. So that's kind of, is that the right?
Yep.
Yeah, track.
Perfect. So that, do you know, there's no right or wrong answer, by the way. It's you're not being marked on the answer. It's perfect. It's beautiful. Thank you for what you're sharing. So Faisal, I think I'm interested with, like, you know, the cold community. What works best if you want to reach reach those men? Do we need a cold group, or does it have to be a Syrian group and an African group, or does it have to be a West African or an East African, or can it just be men in Sydney or men who are overweight? What's the best way to reach these stubbornly hard to reach culturally and linguistically diverse men?
Yeah, well, I look at it within two different perspectives. One is, this is a culturally linguistically diverse group. Let's address it as a totality, as individuals or human beings or men, rather than say Greek, Italian, Lebanese, and so on. So basically, lost you there, Glenn. All right. So the way I look at it is, again, as I said, if there is a need, if I identify, for example, I'll give you examples of this. It is very important to really contextualize and to understand that within the Australian setting, there exist many cultures and religious beliefs, and that within each Celt community, for example, it's got its own unique culture, and it's got its own unique cultures and beliefs that define the normative values, for example, of the individual or the group they belong to. And so within these cultures, in order to determine how to be successful and proceed in terms of defining how their life experience, how their values and health beliefs and practices define how they react, how they integrate, how they work with us. So it's really important for us as health practitioners to go back to the cultural awareness and sensitivity, to have an awareness of that, to work with that in order to provide care and health enablement that would assist them with that. So for example, when I deal with groups, I look at them as though they're culturally linguistically diverse. This is an issue about integration, assimilation, looking at the totality of this group as though they are individuals from different groups, different Celt groups, look at them as still men, still Australian men, with a different modality of how we communicate. But for example, let's say I separate some of these issues when I'm dealing with a group of men, Muslim men, who, for example, come Ramadan, they want to fast, they have diabetes, and the majority of them are contraindicated because of medication, complexity, history of hypers. So how I would deal with this, for example, as different, I mean, it's no good putting a Greek individual there because they don't understand the ramifications of religious beliefs in Islam and diabetes. So that's when I would separate the group and discuss with them, for example, aspects of diabetes, aspects of their health beliefs, aspect of the religious beliefs, how it relates to diabetes. If you are enabling yourself or putting yourself at risk because of your religious beliefs to have complications with diabetes, then really that's contraindicated. I'd say no, and you're exempt. And for those, for example, I've come, maybe not men as such, but let's say a pregnant woman with gestational diabetes who wants to fast because of strong religious beliefs. So I'd say to her, for example, if you've got a 2-year-old child, would you force the child to fast? And she'd say no, or the father would say no, I definitely wouldn't. So I'd say, then how would you expect your wife, for example, who is pregnant with gestational diabetes, to really fast during Ramadan when you're putting her and the baby at risk? So really you've got to approach it from a different point. So work within cultural awareness, sensitivity, their beliefs and practices. It's not what I believe, it's what they believe. How can I best succeed in that? So that's the way I follow it. And as I said earlier, cultural awareness is very important. And you can't know every religion, you can't know every culture, but it's important to have an understanding. Even speak some of the words, understand some of the words. And you find a lot of the men, for example, in Arabic cultures, fail to engage healthcare professionals because, one, they feel of being stigmatized, they feel of shame. For example, I have men who talk about erectile dysfunction, and it's only then they talk about when you approach and discuss with them, gain the faith, gain their acceptance and confidence, and then talk about these issues from an objective manner.
Great, thank you, Faisal, and thanks again for putting cultural competence into the conversation. So I want to move to my final sort of like bit of exploration, building on that, and I want to ask if there are culturally competent ways of working with men as a group, because we've heard just in this small conversation that men are so diverse. Is it possible for there to be a kind of a male-friendly approach to working with men and boys, which works for all men and boys in general? Or if you prefer, is there a cold-friendly or a LGBTIQ-friendly approach? Are there generalities that we can apply? I mean, particularly to males, because that's the point of our conversation, but slice it again anyway where you want to, because it sounds that men are so diverse and individual that it's impossible to actually deliver a male-friendly approach. Michael Riley, are the ways of working with men, regardless of their background, which we can bring to all interactions?
Yeah, I think some of the things that Aiden mentioned earlier from an emotional connection perspective, I think are just critical ingredients in working with all clients, whether it be male or female, young or old, and regardless of sexuality and gender and socioeconomic backgrounds. It's about that connection, being empathic, being able to genuinely hear them in the conversation and to walk with them. But I suppose one thing that I have found helpful in working with men that is a little bit distinct in regards to potentially working with younger generation as well as with women is to definitely incorporate into your practice or into your approaches a pragmatic stance. I found particularly working with men in groups, they and often when we do men's behaviour change work, we work with a male-female co-leadership model, and it's important that and I've seen it play out a little bit where sometimes the woman's voice that is extremely important in that dynamic is that if there's too much sharing initially, that the men can disconnect. And even from the very first few sessions where it is about rapport building and building a connection with the men, it's them being able to walk away at the end of each session knowing pragmatically, what can I use? So we know as therapists that it's more about the emotional connection in what they're doing with themselves and with others. It's more important than the skills, but it's for men, they need to have something tangible. They need to be able to walk away and know, okay, I've got a clear approach or a clear strategy that I'm going to utilize, and that gives them something that they can hook into. And I've just found personally that I try to do that, particularly with men, to give them something that they can walk away with. I've even found of late, when men have worked a little bit, on a deeper level on themselves, is giving them then tools where they can go deeper. So whether it be some good readings or articles or YouTubes, whatever it is, they love it, because then they just absorb it and they think, yeah, I've got something, I've got some homework, but something I'm going to actually go and do and practice, and then I can report back and say how it's worked. And I've just found that particular approach is useful with men.
That's great, Michael. I'm reminded of a session I ran with a colleague on running groups with men, and the practitioners were male and female. And my colleague had run loads of men's groups. One of the women asked, "But will the men actually talk if you do this?" And he just said, "Look, it's like this. Men like structure. They follow rules. If you tell them at the beginning, the rules of this conversation is you share like this, then they will do it." And so there is something definitely in that kind of like that pragmatic, which doesn't mean to say that you don't get the emotional connection. It's just maybe a different route into emotional connection. And whilst that might not work for all men, it's certainly there's a broad generality that men of many backgrounds relate to that. I mean, similarly today, listening to the culturally and linguistically diverse session and trying to work out how on earth do the guys down in South Australia who run the South Australia Multicultural Men's Group make sense of all those different populations of men in South Australia. And one of the things they said was, well, we have a game of soccer and they all turn up and they play and they chat afterwards. And it's like, okay, there's another example that, again, it doesn't work for all men, but for men of many different backgrounds, having an action-orientated approach and then talking shoulder to shoulder afterwards, it can apply across many different settings and still the emotion gets built underneath. So yeah, that's useful. Thanks, Michael. And what about you, Greg? Is there such a thing as in a world where all men are individual and have great diversity, is there any such thing as a culturally sensitive, male-friendly approach to working with men?
Yes. And it's called Mr. Perfect. In a perfect world. I've been sitting here thinking about inclusion, the last question. And look, what I like about Mr. Perfect, the program I've been working with, which offers free barbecues to men in like most states in Australia to come along and just have something to eat, and offers an invitation to talk about mental health problems they want, is the inclusion in there. It's fantastic. And it like my whole life, it's been like, oh, if you run a gay group, gays go, and if it's straight people, they go there and somebody goes there. What I love about Mr. Perfect is its ability to bring together men from different classes, from different cultural backgrounds, from different ages, from different sexualities, gay, straight, bi, and different. We don't ask, but when we started up in Islington's a very close to the trendy gay centres of Newcastle, and yes, there are some. And so we were getting that mix of gay and straight. We're about to move tomorrow to another area that's very community focused in Carrington. And what I like about what happens in those couple of hours is that these guys come together and talk about stuff, politics, health, sometimes mental health concerns, and they do it in such a great way that it's so inclusive. It really is. We have a lovely, very elderly 90-year-old Italian man who comes along and just is there to listen and to eat all the olives, right? And which he did last time we met, but he's great, and he'll tell a story and other young men will listen to that, and other men, you know, it's a great example, Mr. Perfect, of what the potential. There's so much potential in Mr. Perfect to be that inclusive project that you're talking about, that ticks all those boxes of bringing men together just to have a yarn and something to eat. And it's very simplistic, and I love that model. So it's not the best. I like Mr. Perfect very much, but I think if we run more programs with those ingredients in them, we're going to be more successful. We're going to be more inclusive, and the other thing we're doing is we're being men friendly. Our barbecue, we couldn't be more men friendly than that. You know, most men appreciate food, and we do cater for vegetarians and vegans as well on the food side of things. But culturally, you know, I've often thought we should have, you know, do more in Mr. Perfect about cultural groups, but it seems to happen pretty normally in Newcastle. They just come along and they have a good time. So I don't feel we have to, you know, do anything special. But they're a good example of what you've all been talking about, how to be inclusive.
Yeah, that's no. Go ahead.
Perhaps I can add on something else.
Yeah.
We're talking earlier, just to add on from what both Greg and Glenn was talking about. There are a number of cultural awareness or cultural sensitivity tools available on the market. And a lot of agencies, hospital settings, for example, have created cultural awareness or cultural knowledge or sensitivity forums or discussions as part of their orientation in order to facilitate better understanding of the cultural issues within health service delivery. The one thing I really find very important, for example, an example of that is going back to the Muslim communities or Arabic speaking communities. We say why a lot of men are reluctant sometimes to engage in health services. And often women is the case in Muslim and Arabic communities, because as we know, for married Arabic speaking women or for married Muslims, a lot of them won't access services because they've got this stigma or fear of having to meet a male health professionals or a doctor or a clinician who would all of a sudden, in their sense, violate their identity of asking about women's business or women's health issues. And the same token, for example, an Arabic speaking individual who would be reluctant to talk about their erectile dysfunction, talk about their issues, talk about health, mainly because within Arabic speaking communities, this is a mark of masculinity. For a man, for example, who, you know, is seen in Arabic speaking communities, I'm a man, I'm very sexually active. And the other, for example, misnomer that I come across a lot of Arabic speaking men or young men have no qualms whatsoever of having a girlfriend who they can sleep with, yet when they are thinking about marriage, their wife has to be a virgin. So there's really a dichotomy or ambivalence about values. So we really have to try to promote. I mean, I've come across a lot of female Arabic speaking women who have been in situations, divorced or situations. All of a sudden, this 22-year-old woman cannot be involved or remarry because she's seen as she's not a virgin anymore. So we really need to use the cultural competency tools, sensitivities, and in order to alert, educate, inform men that really this is a changing world. We're no longer living in the past, which is about culture has a big impact, but this is Australia. We are changing. We really need to go with the times, progress, move forward. And this is the challenge that I find sometimes.
Thanks, Faisal. I'm going to come to Aiden in a second, but first I'm going to ask everyone who's listening if you have any comments, any feedback, or any questions. Now is the time to drop them in the chat box as we start to move towards the final round of questions. But if you've got feedback you want to give, if you've got any comments you want to make, or if you've got any questions you want to ask, now's the time to drop them into the chat box, and we'll make sure that they're included in the conversation in some way. So, Aiden, I mean, maybe if you want, look at it from the perspective of, LGBTIQ plus friendly. Is there such a thing?
I don't know. No. I think there is. I think it comes, for me, like coming back to rural, like really rural, back to sort of doing outreach in country Victoria, etc. there's a lot being done, and I see that, like especially with young people, like there's definitely a lot of groups and resources, but I think once the 18 plus age hits, it just goes down that there's nothing really available. And I think it really is the people like us as workers, etc., having a better understanding of the LGBTIQ plus history, the barriers that they face, that the interconnection between the past and the present, and how that's, the implications of that, on our community. And I think sometimes there is still a barrier in people connecting with the LGBT community. I think it's not that they don't try, but I just feel there is still this gap. Like I know, for example, I've been back for a while and people are aware that I'm back. So they're like, go to Aiden, go to Aiden, go to Aiden, go to Aiden. Whereas I've sort of, I've had to sort of put a foot down and say, well, no, I'm not the rainbow person. Because I think it's a responsibility for everyone. And I think that comes in general with any community, is that if we're not aware of something, then we as workers should be really educating ourselves constantly so that we are able to provide support for no matter who they are and who presents to us. So I think, I think there is difficulty still in people connecting with health services due to feeling they can't connect. And I think too, when you were talking on earlier, when you first started, is in regards to research and stats, etc. It doesn't exist. We can only go by our people that are willing to do certain surveys and statistics and things like that. There's a whole other range of people within the community, and that's in relation to people that don't even fit under the umbrella. So men that sleep with men, they don't necessarily identify as gay, etc. So, there's this huge cohort, I think, that we're still missing in relation to men's health. And then, the interconnections between, just that, subject in some ways that can impact on the rest of the community in relation to health and STIs and things like that, and then mental health as well. So,
and how important do you think it is for? So you've reiterated the point about data, and it's actually if you don't count stuff, it doesn't count. But also, what was coming up for me as you was talking about the need for us to educate ourselves about histories and different experiences. What role does lived experience and thinking about males and men? What roles does it think? What role do you think that plays? I think I'd be interested, your thoughts about visibility and hearing stories and.
I think it creates some empathy and connection, even with the interconnection with younger LGBTIQ men and elderly LGBTIQ men. I think there's a bit of ignorance when it comes to the young people, that they don't really realise that, our elderly generation, and that's men and women, have really fought, and it's been a continuation of people rallying and really fighting for us to be heard. And I think at some point, and even during the marriage equality debate, I think people got fatigued. And I think now it's almost as though the conversations have stopped, but they need to keep on happening. And I think they need to keep on happening because, especially in rural Victoria, there's an increase in suicide rates, there's an increase in substance use, and that's in the general population as well. These are all things I think that we need to continue having these conversations, and we need to recognise the work that has already been done, but also how we can build on from that.
Right. I just want to read a message from Dan, who's just leaving. Dan from Multicultural Health Services. I think that's in Western Sydney. It's been a lovely week. I've learned lots from various keynote speakers. Huge thank you to everyone involved. Such a wonderful conference, despite the challenges posed by COVID-19. It's been great to meet you all. Have a relaxed weekend ahead. Bye, Dan. We haven't quite finished, but good weekend. Good weekend to you. Yeah, Aiden. Thank you so much. I'm sort of like struck by memories of Indigenous colleagues standing up and talking about the need for Aboriginal men to make sense of the impact of colonization, not to be stuck in a victim narrative, but in order to make sense of where they've come from so that they can better plan the future. The stories of male survivors of sexual abuse coming out after many, many years. Our panelist, Greg, speaking on Wednesday, going right back to 1971 and some of his experiences in the early gay rights movement, all of these, and the veterans, the number of older, because I spent a week with older men in Newcastle, the stories that I heard, including all those men in their 70s who were conscripted to fight in Vietnam and they're still carrying around that trauma. So many stories that need to be told and understood, and how important it is for us, not just as individual workers, but as a society, to actually be aware of all those different stories and in histories, to properly understand men and boys in all their diversity. We've hit 4:15, and I'm going to give you each a minute or two each to wrap up with whatever final thoughts you have. Aiden, you almost answered my final question, which was we need to educate ourselves about those stories. And the question, that's the answer, that's one answer to my question, which is what can we all do as individual practitioners to make our services more accessible, more inclusive of men and boys and all their diversity. You can have another crack at adding another point if you like, but I'll come back to you in a moment. So Greg, you've got your hand up. I'll come to you. Whatever you want to say, Greg, plus the question, what can we all do to make our services more inclusive to men and boys and all their diversity? I'll come to Greg, then to Michael.
Yeah, just a quick one, picking up on what Aiden said in there, which is really important. Look, sometimes, I lived in Sydney, gay world. There's men in Sydney who are gay, who eat gay food, go to gay movies, lead a total gay existence, is what we used to call gay community attachment. Huge in Sydney and Melbourne. Research into that says they have the biggest rates of mental health illness and suicide. So let's learn from that. The alphabet soup thing is worrying people all across Australia, because they don't know what it means. Most of the time, there's a lot of gay people don't know what it means. You work in a regional area like I do. It's really about gay, straight, and blokes and Sheilas up here. Come on, So I think there's a lot in what you said and about how the gay community can set up its own barriers in large capital cities to working with other people. And I think on another level, on a bigger, broader pictured level than that, the National, LGBTIQ Health Alliance, we have been trying for a long time to work with them. They're very good at what they do. They do great work. They know a lot about sexuality. They're confused about gender. Gender really confuses them. When we talk about men's health and women's health, they look at us vaguely going, what's that? So we're trying to work with them. We're trying to establish these things, in a better way. But sometimes it's difficult. It's a long process. There's lots of politics involved in it. I don't know how I can answer that actual neat question for you, Glenn, except say, yes, we can all work toward, we all need to, as workers, I guess, work towards being more inclusive and show by example that we're doing that, like lots of people in the room are doing that at the moment.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for everything you've contributed, not just today and this week, but in the past 50 plus years. Message from Ross Dean, who's been in and out of the room all week. Hey, Ross, in reflection of the past 5 days, what I'm walking away with, I am confident that the concept of healthy manhood has moved forward. Healthy, respectful manhood means valuing and respecting women, girls, and LGBTQ, trans, and non-binary people, and respecting and valuing oneself by striving to live authentically. A huge thank you to every presenter, organizer, support person, and participant. I'll leave with a huge smile and expanded understanding of self and others. That's wonderful feedback. Thanks, Ross. Michael, the killer question, what can we all do as practitioners to make our services more inclusive to men and boys in all their diversity?
I think it's the acceptance that we have more commonalities than we do have differences, and so that's a nice principle for us to be assured that the work that we do, regardless of the diversity of clients that we have, is to tap into the core skills of connection and engagement that as practitioners, as empathic men, that we can continue to build on so that we can engage with men and really listen and hear them. But I think there is also that responsibility that we have to amplify our understanding of the diversity within our communities. When I think of some of the projects, even in New South Wales, that we've been involved with Relationships Australia, there's a Blue Sky program that was for the LGBTIQ community in men's behaviour change. It was that responsibility that we had to learn the nuances and the differences of dealing with that community in that space of men's behaviour change. It was really important for them to connect because they didn't have trust. That, you know, their life experience was, well, why would I put my hand up and go and ask for help when there isn't the trust there? So we have a responsibility to do that. And same too with a Building Stronger Families network, which is through Settlement Services Australia in and I've forgotten your name, Fuzzy was talking about in regards to the Arabic and the Haragi language community, is again understanding some of the language that we need to put in the adaptation for some of the resources that we have, again, in men's change. So it's highlighted again to me how important it is that we're still quite new in the space of adaptation to a lot of the work that we're doing, but we need to continue to strengthen it because it's so important if we're going to build that trust and engagement with the diversity of communities that we're dealing with.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for your great contribution from your outdoor broadcast today. It's been wonderful to have you with us. Faisal, what can we all do to make our services more inclusive to men and boys in all their diversity?
Thanks. Sorry to correct you, Glenn, at this late period.
Okay, go ahead.
It's, by the way, it's Faisal, not Faisal, but
Faisal.
Not that it matters.
It does. It matters enormously. To include you, I need to call your name. So,
it's okay.
Faisal.
I'm beyond the name. It's more than a name. Look, the one thing I'd like to say is my take-home message on this is when you're working with men, whether culturally diverse or otherwise, it's important to recognize that communication is very important, significant, especially when interacting and engaging men in a health setting. As you know, I've worked in emergencies and other settings, diabetes and so on. So it's really important that when you engage men, you do it in a language and modality they can understand and they relate to. It's also, you know, where relevant, as I said, that we communicate this, especially with CALD communities, in a culturally sensitive and competent modality or awareness, because they recognize, acknowledge, engage with, and it relates to their treasured aspects of culture, health beliefs and practices. So this is how you succeed in that. It's often I've found when you speak to an individual from a different culture without trying to understand who they are, where they come from, their background, they just quickly disengage from you. So again, it's very important. And that's the take-home message I give. And thank you for everything.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been wonderful to have you here all week with your huge experience and passion and commitment, Faisal. I will strive to get your name right. I had a cold shiver down my spine when I remembered my ex-wife and our daughter Josie, and my Northern English grandmother would call her Josie. And she would, well, you tell your mother she's called Josie, not Josie. So you've just reminded me of that. Plus
I must admit that men can multitask. I have been sneaking away from time to time to do telehealth with some patients, so it's all right.
Amazing. Good work. Yeah,
We do multitask.
I've been defying the gender stereotype by doing some email work in the background and sending emails out with lots of mistakes in them, but there we go. I've also learned this week that it's called footy, not footy. I'm still learning to speak Australian. So Aiden, you're the final one. You said about educating ourselves about people's histories, but any final thoughts on what we can all do to make our services more inclusive to men and boys in all their diversity?
I think it sort of goes on from what Faisal said, was it's really about, you know, how we communicate with men, but also allowing them to feel comfortable. It's not about us feeling comfortable. It's about them actually being able to communicate the way that they communicate, and us, you know, being, I guess, diverse in the way that we work. And I would say taking it slow, allowing someone to build that trust and rapport, and, you know, allowing them to speak their truth and express themselves and show emotion. That's what I would take from it.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aiden. That's a wonderful final thought, not just for today's session, not just for today, but for Men's Health Connected 2021. I now will give the final word to the last person in the chat box, which is Helen Glover, who says, I'm so grateful to have had a space to hear from all the amazing presenters in this conference. Many thanks to everyone who's spoken this week, everyone who's participated, the production team, our staff, everyone who's been involved in making Men's Health Connected 2021 happen. And a final thank you to our panelists, to Aiden, to Faisal, to Michael, and to Greg. Goodbye.
And a big thank you to you, Glenn, and the team for putting this on. It's been fantastic. I'm sure everyone in this last Zoom room will join me in thanking Glenn for all the hard work that he's put into this.
Here. I was just about to say that. And the producers, and to you, Greg, well done. I want to see more of this.
Very welcome.